Welcome back to Season 5 of the True Blue Conversations podcast with your host, Adam Bloom. Podcasters, Adam's book, Easy Target, Taming the Black Dog, is now available for pre-order. Head on over to Booktopia, Dimmicks and Big Sky Publishing to pre-order your copy and be one of the first to read Adam's story of surviving to thriving and how he escaped the cycle of being an easy target. Easy Target, Taming the Black Dog by Adam Bloom. Coming soon. G'day podcasters. Before we get underway with True Blue Conversations, just wanted to give a huge shout out to our friend and sponsor, the Warrior U podcast, hosted by Bram Connolly. Bram is a former Special Forces commander, best-selling author, popular podcast host, and human optimization pioneer. He has an authentic style and the unique ability to not only motivate, but also take people on a journey of self-discovery. Through the Warrior U podcast, Bram interviews guests in a bid to explore all things human optimization, resilience, leadership, and coffee. His book, The Commando Way, a Special Forces Commander's Lessons for Life, Leadership and Success, is available now on amazon.com.au. So from Adam Bloom and all of us here at True Blue Conversations, a big shout out to the Warrior U podcast, Bram Connolly, and his new book, The Commando Way, out now. Welcome, loyal listeners of True Blue Conversations. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Australian Warfighter Coffee. Veteran-owned and run, driven by a simple yet powerful motto: people over profit. Every dollar goes towards supporting veterans and first responder charity groups. Head on over to AustralianWarfighters.com and use the code TRUEBLUE for your exclusive discount. Because let's face it, any other coffee is just brown sadness water. Now, let's get on with the show. We'd like to thank Tactical Recovery for sponsoring this show. Head on over to tacticalrecovery.com.au and use the code TRUEBLUE for one hell of a discount. Tactical Recovery, magnesium-based muscle care, salty products for sore fuckers.
G'day, welcome back to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Bloom. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Police Superintendent Deb Wallace, retired. And Deb she served for 37 years. That's correct, Deb?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, 37 years in the New South Wales Police. And she's joined us today to talk about her amazing career and her life after service. So, Deb Wallace, it's an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me.
No, it's, as I said, Deb, it's an absolute honour. And so before we get into your career, let's go back to a young Deb Wallace. What was life like, and what were you like at school, and what was life like growing up?
Yep. I'm a Western Suburbs girl. One would say from a working class family. I was born in the Cabramatta Hospital, lived at Westmead all my life, went to Cabramatta High School, worked at Cabramatta, later lived at Cabramatta, and go for Cabramatta.
So you're a Cabramatta fan.
I'm a tragedy.
I really feel sorry for you, Deb.
Oh,
sorry.
thank you for that.
I'm a Penrith supporter, so there you go. So it's, you would have had some good times with Cabramatta back in the day.
Yeah, and I was I remember my history with Cabramatta is from my earliest memories, so say 5 or 6, going across the golf course at Westmead into Cabramatta Park and into the Cumberland Oval in those days. And I remember great memories with my dad. It was my dad and I day out, and it was actually on Dad's deathbed, and he was dying of emphysema, and he only had a number of hours to live. And the doctor said, you want to say anything? And I said to Dad, because we had a bit of a wicked sense of humour, Dad, I've got to ask you something. He said, well, hurry up, I'm running out of time. I said, Dad, why did we always get to the games late when I was a kid? And he looked at me and he said, you'd never worked it out. I said, no. And he said, well, you always got in free at half time because we didn't have the money. So, but I really, one would say that struggle street sort of thing. Dad had 3 jobs. Mum was a stay-at-home mum. At school, one would say I was not an academic genius, let me tell you. Probably sat really middle, really, if one would say, beige. I was a beige sort of kid, like just sort of blended in with the rest.
So, and something that I know all too well of, Deb, emphysema. My nan, actually, who you and I spoke off air, she died of emphysema as well. So, terrible disease, horrible to see. And and for you, is that where your hard work ethic came from? Your parents, and then you, so going through high school, what did you want to do when you grew up? As like, did you always want to join the police, or where did that come from?
Not at all. It was out of the blue, and it was a case of it was the best option. I really wanted to be a travel agent. Probably still do, really. Probably left my run a bit late. But my dad, being, again, working class family for girls, it was my two brothers became plumbers, so get a trade, and the two girls do typing. So even in year 12 or sixth form back then, I was put into Cabramatta Business College so that I could get a typing job, which I did. And my dad had three jobs. He was a locksmith for Prospect County Council, which was an electrical company. He was a taxi driver as well. And then he cleaned a factory a couple of nights a week. So hard worker. So that's what we were brought up with. So I knew when I left school on my last day of sixth form, coming home in Cabramatta, was October of 1977. And my dad said to me, what are you going to do with your life? And I didn't know how to tell him I wanted to lay around for 3 months till I went to travel agent school at Granville TAFE. And he just shut me down and said, it's all right, don't you have to worry about that because I've got you a job at Prospect County Council. You're a clerk typist and you can be there for life because it's a government job and you're starting on Monday. And so that's where I went. Stayed there till 1982, so 3 or 4 years. And then I thought, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. And
you want more of a challenge?
Yeah, I knew, it's funny, I knew way back then I didn't want to have children. And people said, how did you know that? And I just didn't have people say, well, you're only 18, what would you know? But I just knew. And then I was flicking through the paper and there was an ad at the end of 1982 for the New South Wales Police Force for recruits, but looking for women. Because women weren't front line. They did an amazing job for, decades before. But it wasn't until 76 that women were allowed to join as the same as men. Yep. So that really sparked, I figured it might be interesting, it'll be a career, it's a government job, my dad will be happy and I can stay there for life.
Ticks all the boxes.
Yeah, so that's how that came about.
So you joined the police in 1983 and it's funny that you say that you said that you didn't want to have children, but I've heard from other police that served with you and know of you that you had that mother instinct of that you looked after your teams and you were always fair and were you were leadership by the front for your team. And it's ironic that you didn't have children, but they became your children.
Yeah, I think as you progress through, I think I tried to I was always taught treat others how you'd want to be treated. And I was so lucky through my career that I really had the most positive experiences from my commanders around me. I think I was just lucky. I had these great bosses and I learnt from those ones that I chose to follow that if I rise through the ranks, I want to be like them.
Yep.
And so it was really important for me I think you get the best out of your team if you're there for them.
Absolutely. And so for you joining the New South Wales Police in 1983, at a time I wasn't obviously born then, Deb.
Thanks for telling me that.
So I was born 9 years later, but in that time, what I've been told from my parents and also many others is that it was a time where women were seen but not heard. And for you joining the police, did you feel that you went into the lion's den, as they would say, when you joined in 1983?
It was. I thought that would be the case because my first station was Blacktown and Mount Druitt was a substation, so Blacktown, Mount Druitt. Mm-hmm. I guess what I saw down at the academy really set me up is I struggled with the fitness. I was not a fitness person and I didn't realise this fitness component was the same as the men.
Yep.
But really early on, we had a fitness trainer called Brian Chickamore who was iconic.
Yep.
Devil incarnate, I would often call him. But it was back then when he saw me struggling. He gave me a hard time for a month to really test me. After about a month, he got me aside and said, "You're not going to make this." And I thought he's going to kick me out. And he said, the only way we're going to do this is if you stay back and show some commitment, and I'll stay with you. So he stayed with me for the next 2 months, every afternoon in his own time, to get me fit enough. Mm-hmm. So I realised then that although I was hearing, these, they're not used to women, you'll probably be ostracised, I really realised then they were really helpful. Went out to Blacktown, Mount Druitt, again, hardly any women, and they were amazing. So very quickly, I really realised that it's about the individuals that might have an attitude, not the majority. But I think I got my best advice on my first day when I walked into the station. Walked in with my 2 colleagues from my class, 2 males, and out from behind the counter came a female second-class sergeant. Joan never gave up her age, but she was probably, I'd estimate at the time, probably in her 50s. She was transitioned. She was from the original police women, transitioned across but didn't want to go front line. So she was the station sergeant. And she took me aside and she looked at me very seriously. She had this beautiful red hair. She was, although in uniform, I sensed this sense of style about Joan. And she's looked me up and down. She said, I'm going to give you some advice. And I thought, and the 2 boys were taken away upstairs, but she says, before you go to meet the commander, I just want to say something. I said, oh, yes, Sergeant. She said, never compromise your integrity or your femininity. Be true to who you are and remember you're a policewoman, not a policeman. You don't have to fight the men to be accepted. And I thought that was... So, yeah, I sort of became known for my flamboyant way of dressing bright suits, but that was what I was. I was a girly girl.
Yep.
And I was endorsed way back, someone who everyone respected, Joan Stedman, her name was, that I could be myself.
Well, I just want to go back just a second, because you at the academy, you were at the old academy, weren't you? So you were not the academy that it is today down at Goulburn, and where ironically you passed out finally when you retired, which we'll get to later on. But you were at Redfern, and you... So that was the old... Were you one of the last to go through Redfern? And what was Breakfast Hill like?
Oh, they made us just to go for this 10K run. That was the first day. And then we had this thing, in Centennial Park, so we had to run around Centennial Park. There's a 3-tiered hill. And it wasn't... we called it Breakfast Hill. I don't think anyone else did. And I asked this stupid question one day because I said, he said, we're going to run up Breakfast Hill. And I said... Why is it called, said to Sergeant Moore, why is it called Breakfast Hill? He just looked out the side, looked down at me because he was 6'4", bald head. He said, you'll find out soon enough, girlie. How fantastic to call you girlie. I thought that was great. Anyway, I found out because it was called Breakfast Hill because you had to run up and down and at the top do burpees. Oh. And you had to continually do that until the last person threw up. So we all used to conspire and say, throw up really early because we can get out of this. So the grass on the top was really green, well fertilised. So.
And so you mentioned your first station was... And with the academy, what did you learn about yourself? And we'll get to Blacktown in a minute, but what did you learn about yourself that you didn't already know?
I think I learned that I'm up for a challenge, and I also learned that it's okay to say I need help. When Chica reached out and said to me, I'm going to help you through this, it was okay to show my weakness and okay to say, I'm not going to do this without your help. So that I learned that very early, that you can say to people, it's okay to say, I need help.
I think that's a great piece of advice, Deb, that anyone who is looking to undertake, something that may be out of their depth or, and ask that question of, hey, I'm a bit unsure, can I just get that help? And just a bit of guidance, mentorship, whatever you want to call it. Great advice, absolutely. And so what do you remember of your first shift and when you're out on the beat? And for you, obviously you graduated, really, really proud moment, and for your whole family and yourself. Did you feel that you were ready to go and police the dangerous streets, and did you feel 10 foot tall and bulletproof?
No, the opposite. I felt this is a huge responsibility, and what you learn in the academy is fantastic, but how is this really going to transition onto the streets? But in those days, and I was so lucky, and it's probably a bit different these days, but in those days, junior officers were probably in the minority, so you were trained by the best. So, and we had a buddy system, so we had, which I think they still have today. And so I was put with Senior Constable Ronnie McGowan, and no one will mind me saying this because Ronnie was quite short. He was a rescue operator, and he was a little bit chubby, nothing bad, but they used to, and he introduced himself. He said, "You're my buddy," and I said, "Yes, Senior." He said, "Please call me Ronnie or LFT," and I'm going, "What's LFT?" I thought lieutenant or something. I'm thinking. He says, "No, it's obvious, isn't it?" I said, "No, Senior." He said, "Little fat turd," and I've gone, and we had this beautiful bond. So I learned at the time, and he was amazing, as were all our training officers. But we got to learn from highly experienced. I think Ronnie had 12, 13 years, and they took us under their wing. I couldn't have done it without him. He was amazing.
So, and I want to talk because there's a few things that I've read in your book and I listened to on a couple of other podcasts, and there was a time where you went to a pub and for you, were you, Deb, what I remember is, and what I've looked up is that you were in the dress, you had to wear a dress, and your gun was in your handbag, and all not very practical for being a police officer on the streets. Can you tell us about the time you went to the pub and what happened with Ronnie that you sort of gained a bit of respect from him in that sense?
Yeah, on this day I was actually working with someone different. What happened is...
Sorry.
No, after our 6 months, we were then, or 6 weeks, we were then put out like with anyone that worked. But because they didn't have many women there and they really didn't know what to do with us because they were quite protective of us. And I suppose a little bit of saying, well, we've got to protect them. We can't send them out onto the roughest times. So they used to have this system where the females or the most junior officers would work with the sergeant. So you had the 2 car crews. We had 3 car crews on every shift. The 2 car crews, the old F100 trucks, always had the senior constables, and then the female or the most junior officer worked with the sergeant. And so he was in the sedan and he was like drove around, if they needed support. So we didn't go to we weren't first on scene for those really sort of dangerous moments. After about 6 months, it was time, and I came in on a night shift, Friday night, busiest night in the command, 11:10. And Friday night was busy in Blacktown, Mount Druitt, because the pubs used to shut at 11 and no one wanted to leave. And we had some fairly interesting pubs. One in particular, the Stockade at Layla Park, was known for its somewhat rough clientele towards the end of the evening. And so I walked in and for the first time in 6 months, I looked down and I'm actually on the flagship 27-1. But I'm working with this amazing man, Senior Constable Paul Garner, who was feared by criminals and cops alike. He was tough. He was 6'3", chiseled out of concrete, and had a swagger. His nickname was Mongrel. And I've looked down and I'm working with him like, God, this is fantastic. He walked in to look at the roster. Well, to say he was less than impressed was an understatement. He just looked at me and said to the sergeant, he used to call me DB, I love her like a sister, but I don't want to work Friday night on the truck with her. Like, heavens above, what are you doing to us all? So after a while, he conceded and we drove out of the car park. He was never going to let me drive. And then the beep went over, which meant an urgent job, and we were called 27-1, respond to a brawl at the Stockade Hotel. And there was no backup because they were all tied up. And on the way there, he's saying to me, I think we're going to get killed, DB. I think we're dead. Now, you're right. At the time, we just transitioned. Girls had gone from skirts, but we're wearing these things called culottes. Now, for those who don't know, they're very unattractive, knee-length shorts that are flary, that look like a skirt. So we're on the way there, and Paul's sort of saying, we're dead, DB. And, there's about 30 blokes going to be involved in this brawl. And all I could think of is I'm going to make a fool of myself because I'm just worried about getting out of this F100 because my culotte might get hooked up on the handbrake, maybe on the baton holder, and I'm going to fall flat on my face, and everyone's going to laugh, and this will be the end of my career. And all I could think of was this. So when we get there, Paul's looked at me because there's 40 blokes out the front punching on, And Paul's just looked at me and said, nice knowing you, DB. And all I could think of was, how am I going to get out of this truck? So I've hoiked my culottes up to mid-thigh, wrapped them around my legs and jumped and made this beautiful landing. Well, of course, the guys punching on realised the cops were there, but looked across and all they could see was this girl in a funny set of shorts. But they stopped and they looked and go, who's morning, hello, mongrel, but they said, who are you, love? And I had to explain who I was. And they said, oh, that's really cool, having a chick, in funny shorts. And said, what do you want? And I said, I don't know, very naively, I'd just like you to order to leave quietly, please. And they looked at me and I thought, oh, here it goes. Mongrel's gone, oh, Jesus. And they just said, love, that you are so politely, we're going to go now. Going to go nice and quietly. And off they went. And we get back in the truck and Paul's just looked at me and shook his head. And I thought, oh, no. And he said, DB, you and me every Friday night from this night on.
Yeah,
and so we did.
And that was probably for you a really good sort of lesson learned. And like you say, you're thinking of, oh, how can I not make a klutz of myself? And maybe that was actually probably a good thing, because not thinking of the danger that you're about to go into. And it just, amazing to think, oh, I've just got to pull my culottes up and I've got to make sure that I've just got to make sure that I don't land on my face. And so you progress through, and for people who aren't aware, Blacktown it's lower economical area, and I'll say that.
Working class.
Working class. And so what sort of crimes did you have to deal with, Deb, and being on the truck? And for you, we'll get into you soon become a detective, and we'll get into that in a minute. But for you, did you always, uniform was where you always wanted to be?
I didn't know where I'd go, but after that, we had to do 3 years in uniform no matter what. So most of our jobs were first response, as in domestics, break and enters, robbery. So first, you go there, and unless it's a very serious job, you do most of it until you give it to the detectives. But I was so happy in uniform with those guys, because they accepted us like Paul said, like our sister, and with Ronnie, we were a family. And all I wanted to do was I would be happy if I spent my entire career on that truck with those guys and girls for the rest of my career.
And for you, there's a funny moment that I read in your book where, can you tell us the time that you were called into your boss's office, and where, I'm going to call it the Deb way, where you went, and can you talk to us about that? Yeah,
we talk about, often people are very much advocating about we need more things for women and more equality. We do need that. We need opportunities. We don't, I'm not but women just want a chance to show that what they can do. But it was a case, us girls sort of said to ourselves, we'll go there and we'll take it slowly. We'll just see how it all works out. But one of the things we had to do back then was, when you do a report for probably any government agency, it's a set template, and you do it the same way. And at the end, your sign-off was a particular way, and your sign-off was your name, Deb Wallace, your rank, which at the time, probationary constable, your registered number, your payroll number, and then your date and the station, and you send that to, as the first, while you're training for the first 12 months, that must go to the Crown Sergeants. We don't have them anymore, but it was a particular rank. They were like the disciplinarians of the organisation. They all look the same, I often thought, as they were always
bald head, fat, overweight?
With a moustache and snarled at you constantly. And and interesting for women, even though we had to write our name, after our registered number, we had to put a bracket, capital F, close bracket. So I did this report. I just come off night shift, and I forget what the report was for, but in the haste. And you had to send it to the sergeant for correcting before it went to anywhere else. So I sent it up, and obviously my grammar was wrong, my spelling was wrong, and it came back as it did, like a school teacher, with all these red marks on it. And I inadvertently forgot to put the F, and there it was in big red writing, F. So I corrected all my grammar, and I looked at that F and I thought, I wonder if I have a go here. So I did. So I sent it back to the sergeant without the F again. Went back upstairs, next shift came down, and there it is again. Everything perfect except this another big red F. So I thought to myself, how far am I going to push this? I said, oh, well, might as well have another go. So I sent it up again, not corrected. Well, over comes the loudspeaker. Probationary Constable Wallace, attend the sergeant's office immediately. I thought, uh-oh. So this could be the shortest career in history. So I walked up to his office, was upstairs, and there he was sitting at his desk, and I knocked on the door, as you did, and enter, screamed from his desk. I went in, you had to stand to attention. He said, I said, Probationary Constable Wallace reporting, sir. And he looked up from his desk and said to me, are you an idiot? And I said, oh, could be, Sarge. I said, my dad reckons I am. And he said, well, I think your dad's smart and I think you're an idiot. He said, what have you got to say about this report? And I said, I'm a bit confused, Sarge. And he said, oh, that's obvious. And he said, what are you confused about? And I said, permission to speak. He said, speak. And I said, look, as you can tell, Sarge, I'm a female. He goes, yes. I said, because I'm wearing these funny shorts. And he said, yes. And you can read my name's Debbie Wallace. Yes. And I said, well, I'm confused because clearly you've worked out I'm a female. So I don't really know why I'm putting F after my name. But if there's someone else at Blacktown who's called Debbie Wallace, who's the guy, I'm happy to put F so you know which one of us it is. Well, I thought he was going to have a stroke. His face went red. He started to stutter. His vein was sticking out of his head. He was spitting. And he just said, get out of my office. So it didn't give me the report back. And I went out of his office. I thought I'm going to be called up to the commander for sure, but I never heard a word. And then 3 months later, a report came from State Command that said women no longer had to put F after their name. I have a feeling that sergeant went to bat for all us females.
I think, as I said when I did the intro to it, you did it the Deb way. That was, you were, I'm going to say it, Deb, and knowing you in the nicest respect, you were a disruptor. And you turned a male-dominated workplace into a place where females were respected and were valued, and that was you coming through with a number of other females as well at the time. But yeah, I think it was you saying, no, we are empowered, and that advice that sergeant gave you was, don't lose who you are, but also fight for who you are as well. And a great example of what you did.
And I think it was a case of we were smart enough to say, anything they ask of us, we'll do, because they're not asking us to do anything they wouldn't do themselves or haven't done themselves, or our male probationary constables did exactly the same. So I think once we said we're not precious, we will dig in, we will work hard, and we're here to be part of your team.
Absolutely. And for you in those early years, how did you deal with the trauma of frontline policing, and was there much support and training given to police in handling the associated stresses in those days, and how did that evolve throughout your career?
Not at the beginning. I think the support came from, because we worked 8-hour shifts, and I'm a real advocate of that. I know you never get it back because of lifestyle changes. I get that. But because you worked with your same team, you became a family. So as much as people turn to their family for support, we turn to each other. And I think that was something that was so strong about the police department or the police force at that stage. In years to come, I remember going to, and again, you just dealt with it and you were with each other and you weren't doing anything everyone else wasn't dealing with. So maybe people had different ways. I had a very grounded family background, is that probably today, it was a bit of a tough love background, I guess, My dad wouldn't probably reach out to cuddle us, but would wash my car. So I know that sounds weird, but it was really, that was how we did it.
Different times.
Yeah, and I remember going to Cabramatta, and we'll get that in the 90s, which was, there was so much violence and so much murders and all of that stuff. And I had this amazing sergeant, Cole Helson. And every Friday afternoon, and I was a non-drinker, I made it very clear that I didn't want to go out, and cops did turn to alcohol sometimes, don't get me wrong, but I just didn't, because I needed to just be, that credibility issue was so important to me. So we would go out, my boss, my sergeant, every Friday afternoon, having a huge week. We wouldn't go home for 3 days sometimes because back-to-back murders. And every Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, he'd say, right, we're going next door. We were next to the Diggers Club at Cabramatta, and we just go next door. Now, there was no expectation to drink at all. It wasn't about that. He always bought me a lemon squash. Mm-hmm. But it was about to spend some time together, a couple of hours, just together, debriefing and chatting in just this out of the office environment. To me, I think that was huge amount of getting us through those tough times.
Yeah, right. And there's that family culture, bonding together. Because I know it myself, being a first responder, Deb, we see things that the ordinary person doesn't see. There's many traumas and things that you see that you can't unsee, and throughout your career you've seen many, as you say, many murders, many horrific crimes, and I've seen my fair share of things as well, being a firefighter. And I think you're right, and at a time too, was there a lot of black humour as well?
Yeah, it's you know, you probably couldn't say the jokes that we said back then. You know, some of the guys for example, at Cabramatta, because I always wore dresses, they'd call me Frock, F-R-O-C-K, and in the most affectionate way. You know, never offended that I was. You know, I guess you're right. It's how we dealt with that was exactly what you said, a bit of black humour.
Well, you have to, because, you know, the ordinary everyday, and I've seen it where they look at you and go, are you guys sane? And you go, yeah, it's just our way of dealing with, it's just our coping mechanism of how we deal with it. And it works for us. And because, you know yourself, if you don't have that black, you won't survive. Yeah. Like you just won't survive. And it's... Yeah, I think it sort of helps you. And I want to go forward to this is what changed your career. And I wasn't, as I said, I wasn't alive when this happened, but in 1986, a beautiful young woman was murdered on the 2nd of February, Anita Cobby, a murder that shocked Australia. And as I said, I wasn't alive, but the public was outraged. And in the way that she was murdered, and Deb, you were there, you were part of this. Can you talk us through the event that changed your policing career and probably your life too? Yeah. And if you can share with us what happened on that night.
Yeah, I was a young uniform cop at the time, so I was just working the station, so I'd been 3 years in the cops, and just working the station, and we heard about a body being found out at Reen Road at Black Tunnel Prospect, which is near the drive-in. Again, detectives go into action, that sort of thing straight away. So my role at that stage was, and ongoing, was fairly limited, only, you know, being a young uniform cop, being part of that, I guess. And it wasn't until a couple of days later, and the man in charge of that case from a Blacktown perspective was Detective Sergeant Graham Rosetta. And we talk about role models and people that have mentored me, and he was certainly played a huge part in my life. At the time and ongoing, and he was in charge as only he could be. He was iconic, and most murders are committed by people known to the victim, and they're the ones that we hear, like the smoking gun murders, I guess you often call, is that small circle, most, as I said, known to the victim. I think Graham worked out that this murder was not that, and that means they're really hard, and all leads are difficult. So after about 3 days, I think maybe even 2 days, the media was starting to withdraw because I realised Graham couldn't, it was no, arrest wasn't imminent. So it was a bit like, well, we need to withdraw, which meant Graham said as soon as the media go, then the contact with the community goes and the answer's in the community. So he was walking, I remember answering the switchboard one day, and it was about 2 days after Anita was found, and Graham's walked past me going out to have a think out in the backyard on his own. And he stopped when he's looked at me, and I'm answering this old switchboard, and he looked at me and he said, Wallace, how old are you? And I said, 24, Sergeant. How tall are you? And I said, I'm 5'8". He said, that's perfect, come with me. So he took me out of the station area and took me up to the detective's office. He said, we have this idea. We want to dress you up in clothes similar to what she was wearing on the night, and we want to do a reenactment of her last few hours because it was a Sunday night. It was probably difficult to get the same commuters. But he said there's a couple of reasons. We've had some good witnesses have given an account of hearing things. We want to do it as an investigative strategy for timing. But more importantly, we want to get the media to follow you from Central, where she entered the train, and all the way with you to a point that we will ask them to leave. And it was a bit of a media gimmick, for want of a better word, but it kept it on the front pages till the following Sunday. So that's how I did that. And it wasn't until after I did the reenactment, it was about 9 o'clock at night back at Blacktown, and I was just with Graham in the car park, and he looked at me in his stern way that he often did. He was a serious detective from the old breaking squad. And he looked at me and said, Wallace, yes, Sergeant, how would you like to be a detective? And I thought, gee, I must have walked good on that train. Anyway, I didn't say that to him. But what he said, do you want to come as be part of the investigation? Now, that was an offer, and as a woman, you learn never knock back a gift horse. You take everything they throw at you. So that's how I went. Now, I didn't do anything. I was given a partner, and we were responsible for locking up all the accessories, those that might have known about the murder in hindsight. But it was my introduction to the world of criminal investigation, and what I saw, I thought, this is where I might belong. And it was right. So that was the beginning of what turned out to be 34 years.
And was that reenactment was everything, did it obviously got its effect because but I read in your book that it didn't quite go to plan because was it timings were out or?
Yeah, we caught an earlier train, I think it was, than she caught the later one. She missed the train, either she missed the first train. So when the witnesses would say, oh no, it was definitely this time I heard the screams and definitely this time I saw the car. That threw them into a bit of panic, going, well, hang on, how could that? And then someone got the train timetable or did a backtrack to say on that night, and they worked out it was delayed or there was a discrepancy. Once that all pieced together, fell into place beautifully. It's
like I've since watched many documentaries on Anita's murder, and it affected me because, as I said to you off air, my mum was a nurse. Mum and Anita were training at similar times. They only a year apart of age with each other, and how she died, it almost brings. I'm almost emotional about it, Deb, because it was just so brutal, and what she went through, just. Yeah, I'm sort of lost for words, actually, because it's just one of those...
I think in a way, people often say, about the outrage, because it was like when they were convicted and sentenced. I remember the scenes on the street, there was like you see in those movies on World War II, people running down the street and hugging and cheering. And why was that reaction? I think because it hit all that thing. She was a young woman, quite beautiful, which had nothing really to do with it at all, but she was. But she was a nurse, so people related to that. She was wrong place, wrong time, just happened to do what anyone would do walking home. It was, February, It was still just getting on dusk. But the fact that the brutality, without going into the facts, I think that was well reported. Some urban myths, of course, were out there, which did fuel speculation, but to say it was brutal, and the fact that she probably had her for a number of hours, and what she went through, I think that just people just I think went, who does that?
Animals.
Yeah, you reflect on human. There was no humanity, and I think that's where I think Janine Balding, not long after, was also another similar, not as Anita's, and people, it didn't get the. I suppose the outrage, and people say to me, but Janine Balding's was, as much as we were all outraged, it didn't get the media coverage perhaps. And I think that was because in a way we'd been so emotionally exhausted from Anita's that when Janine's happened, everyone went, we're now accepting that can happen. Whereas before you never saw it, you didn't hear about it as much because of the media.
And I think too, Deb, just such a beautiful and, as you said, beautiful, take it out. She was a beautiful person, just a beautiful young life, tragically cut short, and of going on of what she would have done, and her parents, Gary and Grace Lynch. How you talk about mentors and you talk about people that have influenced your life. How instrumental were they when you met them and going forward in who you become and who you are today?
Yeah, it's I came in cross-examining in 2020. So I didn't straight after the murder. I felt a bit embarrassed because I had done the reenactment. I felt I was encroaching, and I wasn't a senior detective. I was only very junior, so there was no point in having. They had people liaising with them as well. Like, it was all very. They had to be surrounded by the best of the best. And it wasn't until 2020 that there was the Powerhouse Museum at Kashula wanted to do a exhibition on the impact of crime on victims, and using Anita. It was called the Anita and Beyond, and it wasn't so much focusing. Anita's murder was the central point of it, but it was about the impact of crime on victims. And I got a call from the curator who's going to be putting that together to say they're putting together this curatorium, which is about a group that sort of do quality control, for want of a better word, about how the exhibition's going to look. And I got a call to say, would you go on this curatorium? And I was a bit shocked. They said, Gary and Grace have said it'd be great to have you on it. And I said, that was a bit unusual. Although I'd seen them at court and all that, we never were engaged. Well, I was a bit embarrassed about how much. Anyway, I said, of course, if that's what they want. So I've turned up at the first meeting, and I walked into this big sort of warehouse where the meeting was being held, and it was a fair way from the door to the table where they were all sitting. And Gary got up and walked over to me. We didn't really know each other, but he said to me, he grabbed my hand and said, "I'm so pleased for you to be part of this, Deb." He then led me across to the table. He sat me in a chair between Grace and Gary, and the two of them sat there and held my hand. And from then on, they became a huge part of my life. And then I became part of the homicide victim support group supporters. And of course, this year in February, sadly on the anniversary of Anita's murder, we opened in a legacy to Gary and Grace, but particularly Grace, a world's first trauma centre for children affected by homicide between the ages of 3 and 15, and it's built at Doonside. And it was a $12 million project, but it took us a lot of years, a lot of blood, sweat and tears by amazing people, volunteers, led by Martha Jabor, our CEO. And so now it's called Grace's Place.
And we're going to talk about that later in the pod, because I know you're heavily involved with that, and we'll talk about that later on in the podcast. And so you have Anita's murder, and then you get exposed to that world. And in 1992, you're on the move from Blacktown, and you took the invitation to become a detective. And what was it like for you going to detective school, and what did you learn that fascinated you about becoming a detective?
Oh, I think it was just the tenacity of it. I think I saw it under Graham, and although I never went into homicide because I'm a bit of a sprinter, not a long distance runner, which I think you have to be that really determined. They're like dogs with a bone in homicide. I have so much respect.
One of your good friends, Gary Jublin, so very much a dog with a bone. And some roles suit certain people.
And that just but the world of criminal investigation, I love that. That I love going to court. I love the trials. I have, like you see, a bit like law, although they do it in an hour. I really was intrigued. So that was becoming a detective. So people ask me, what's one of the most significant days of your career? And I remember it. It was the 9th of September 1989. They go, what happened then? And I said, well, that was the day I got my bit of paper that said I was now a detective officially. So it was, and that set my career up for the rest of it.
So did they... Obviously, do you do, like in New South Wales Police, do they do it like Queensland later on, where you actually get your detective badge? Is that
no? We I think they do have a I think it was part of some sort of pay sort of thing they do. I think they have a detective shield. I'm not sure. But back then, no. It just meant that you were designated. They called a designated detective, so you could call yourself detective, sergeant, detectives, and you got a bit of a pay rise. There was an allowance that went with that designation. So a specialist allowance,
incentive,
they called it.
Why not? Yeah, and so let's go forward to you cut your mustard as a detective at Blacktown in the early days, and then in 1992 you moved to Cabramatta, a very different social economical different to Blacktown. what do you remember of your time in Blacktown, and what was the main sort of crimes that you were dealing with at Cabramatta in the early 90s?
Yeah, Cabramatta was an amazing place. I have that. It's probably one of the highlights of my career, being part of that team, not with just with the detectives who were outstanding, but with the community. For those who don't know, it's in southwestern Sydney. Cabramatta takes on the face of the immigration policy of the day. So it's gone through a whole lot of different facelifts, for want of a better word. It's been Eastern Europeans, Italians, etc. But the main, when I was there, was first generation refugees from predominantly South Vietnam. A mixture from Southeast Asia, Laotian, Cambodian, etc., but predominantly South Vietnamese. And 99.9% amazing citizens, like so thankful to be in this country, so thankful, so respectful, so patriotic for their new country, but culturally wonderful. But of course, there was another element. The other element was street gangs, and because the street gangs were a direct line to offshore heroin suppliers, it became what was reluctantly known as one of the biggest street-level distribution centres of heroin in Australia, if not the Southern Hemisphere.
And was that, so you got there, and I read in your book that you got there, and I want to talk about the time that that it had been a murder, and you went to get lunch. And can you tell us this story where you got there, you were with another detective, and a murderer had come up and said, oh, hi, and can you explain us that story?
I'm not sure that one. Yeah, it was a bit of an unusual situation when I first got there, because I'm used to working largely Anglo environments, and everyone was quite different. So I get to Cabramatta, and a young, who's now, they took me for a walk. And they said, we're going to take and show you where all the crime happens. And I said, let's go. And I said, aren't you getting the car keys? They went, no, it all happens in the CBD. And I said, what? Oh, all the extortions, the drug dealing, the murders. Oh, okay. So we started walking up the street. We're chatting about what Cabramatta's like, and etc. And out the side of my eye, I see a guy who I later knew was a gang member, but had the standard uniform of what the gangs wore. We had a black microfiber suit, a white shirt, long hair, and tattoos. And they had this sort of mutual respect relationship between the cops and the gang members. It was quite bizarre. But as I'm walking, the constable, or the young detective I'm with, looked over and waved and said, hello, Dook. And he said, oh, hello, sir. And we walked on over. And then we're chatting. And then it twigged with the detective I was with, oh, Dook, I'm really glad I saw you. And he was I'm glad I saw you too. Introduced me. And he said, no, Dook, I had to see you because I've got to lock you up. He said, what for? And he said, I got to lock up for malicious wounding. You stabbed a bloke with a machete. And I'm going, oh my God, this is very serious. This is going to, what are we going to do here? Do we jump on him? Do we arrest him? We've got handcuffs. And he just looked, it was all very casual. And the gang member said, which one? And I'm going, which one? And the detective said, mate, the one at the club. You nearly killed that bloke. He goes, oh, yeah, I remember that. He said, so would it be any good to say it wasn't me? He said, no, we got you under the cameras, mate. You've got you done for dusting. You're gone. And he went, yeah. And so then the detective said, so I'm thinking, okay, what's the plan here? Serious offender, wounding. It's going through my mind, of which the detective said, mate, if you could be at the police station at 4:00, that'd be great, because we're just going to go and have lunch. And he just said, yeah, no worries, see you later, bye-bye, have a nice lunch. And I said to the detective, we're going to run round the back and we're going to jump on him from behind. He looked at me, no. Are we going to call for backup? No. What are we doing? He said, we're getting lunch. I said, but don't we have to arrest him? Oh, yeah, we're going to arrest him because he's real bad. Yeah, he's going away for a while, that one, yeah. And I said, but do we arrest him now? He went, no, 4:00. And I'm thinking, this is a bit bizarre, but anyway, go with the flow.
Yep.
So we went and had lunch, and at 4:00 they said, oh, Deb, there's someone at the counter for you. And it was about 4:05. And there he is. There's Dook. And he said, "Sorry, madam, for being late. Is it okay?" And I said, "Oh, of course, come in."
I'm just,
And that was how it was. And that's how my time, it was, and no one would, if you didn't experience it, you would not believe it.
So that time you talked about the heroin was very strong and you had a lot to do with the 5T gang.
Yep.
And for people who aren't aware, Deb, can you give us a little bit of background about the 5T gang?
Yeah, the 5T gang it started off, they morphed like any street gang does. So were they organised crime? Venturing towards that, but they were largely what you call a street gang. And they were formed by young men that came out from prison camps, put into detention centre, and then once released had no family. So they bonded together. Mm-hmm. And of course, they were then, cannon fodder, for the more organised crooks who saw them as their foot soldiers, which they became. So they bonded in this really quite unique family type thing, and they had they're called the 5T because they had 5 T's tattooed on their arm. All Vietnamese. They had one Anglo who had done some jail time with them and spoke perfect Vietnamese, so they included him. Mm-hmm. So they just morphed with their leader Tri Minh Tran, who was a very charismatic leader. And they were responsible for organising the street dealers to be their supply line for the organised crime for heroin. And part of it was their territory. They ruled their territory with fierce territorial control. No one was allowed in. They were very strict. There was a lot of violence that goes with typical gangs, etc., etc.
So it was extortion, standover, that, and because I did read that it was all heroin all led out to Cabramatta. That was the train to all led back to Cabramatta at that time. And I guess for you, totally different in the sense of Blacktown to where you were in Cabramatta, and you say the best time of your, like, you fond memories of your time. And was it a different type of policing and a different type of investigating than it was when you were at Blacktown?
Yeah, it was a totally new world because in a way it was you did it with they didn't. Much as they were highly violent, to police they were also respectful. It was, and you wouldn't believe that because there was only a handful of detectives there and they outnumbered us. So there was a way. So arrests were done by appointment. I would walk the street. Like I remember on occasion I had a head cold and I was going up to get Sudafed. I was on an afternoon shift and it was about 8 o'clock and I was going to the all-night chemist and 2 gang members came up. I just went on my own, as you did. 2 gang members came up beside me. "Madam, what are you doing out here late at night? It's Cabramatta. It's very dangerous." And I said, "Dangerous? You're the only ones I've got to worry about." And they went, "Yeah, but we don't hurt you." And I said, "Well, no." And they said, "But we better stay with you till you get your medicine and we'll walk you back to your car." Now, it was quite bizarre because I might lock them up tomorrow, but no one would really believe it. It was a different style. It was, we were very much relied on the community for a lot of support. And we built those relationships very well, I think, because they didn't know about policing this way. Mm-hmm. As in, they were used to a lot of corruption. So we had to really work hard at developing you can trust us. Mm-hmm. And the criminals, to them, it was like there's a revolving door a lot of times. Do the crime we present. It's just easier for all of us. So.
Yeah, and for you, so what happened to the 5T gang? What actually, and how did their demise come about?
They said to me, so Tri Minh Tran, John Newman got murdered in 94, the local member. A lot of now attention came onto Cabramatta, followed not long after the leader, that charismatic leader, Tri Minh Tran, gets murdered. Probably, we never solved it, but we probably know who was responsible, but it was probably not a rival gang, if that makes sense. So a lot of attention now on Cabramatta. So, and there was my boss, a man called Paul McKinnon, he was a chief superintendent. I was working I was a young sergeant. I'd been promoted to sergeant, and there was a lot of pressure on him to break up this 5T gang, who was so resilient. There were so many of them. They just, they could
cut
be
the
replaced.
Head off the snake in a new headed form.
So he gave me this opportunity. There's this opportunity thing again to run this little street gang unit. And and he simply said in a few words, I said, "So what's my role running this little gang unit?" And he said, "Just break up the 5T and stop the drugs." And I think half of it was tongue-in-cheek because there's no way, I had about 15 in my little gang unit. It was just a localised one.
Yep.
So I suppose it was attacking it at all 3 levels. We had no doubt, looking at the import side, being organised crime. We had our specialist areas doing that middle level, and then we were doing. So I think like anything with gangs, you've got to attack at all levels.
Yep.
And it was simply when Tran got murdered, the senior members were talking to me about this, and I told them my new role, and I said, I've got to break you all up. They laughed a bit and said, Madam, we'll give you a hint. There's only 3 ways you stop a gang. And that is you lock us up and you break the cycle. The second thing is we get killed, because that's what happens to gang members. Or if we survive the first 2, we grow up and maybe grow out and become legitimate. So the challenge is not so much breaking us up, because we're now seasoned gang members making those decisions, but there's a generation behind us. So while, say, the specialist areas, and we just did drug operations after day in, day out at that low level, while there's other stuff going on at the high level. And it wasn't until I was struggling with that philosophy about, whatever happens to us, what about the next generation? Because there's ones following us as role models. You need to work with them. You need to get them educated. You need to get them out of this cycle, because that's the only thing that's going to stop it is education and employment and a future. So at that point, taking a long story short, I engaged my dear friend, and who's been a friend of mine since 1995, Father Chris Riley from Youth Off the Streets. And he came out there, and we did a program for a year where he would lead. He was a registered school, and we taught those junior kids school on the street in their environment for that year. And a number of things happened. He eventually took them to his places down on the Southern Highlands, got them out of the Cabramatta area with the consent of the senior gang members, and broke that cycle for those kids.
What strikes me, Deb, is that you sort of out of the box thinking, and you having that, not just that tunnel vision of you're engaging with the criminals and getting their opinions of, well, how do we break this cycle? But out of the box thinking of, well, who can I bring in to help break this cycle? And like you said, you Father Chris Riley, amazing. I've heard only great things about Father Chris Riley, and he used to be on Ray Hadley all the time, come on and talk. And you did a lot of work with him, didn't you? You were part of his team.
Yeah, I didn't reach out to him because I was egotistical, and this is a cop problem, this is a crime problem, and we're going to crush it with crime and jail and all those things. I was really much that way. And when Father Chris came out, someone had told him about this dilemma I had, and he actually imposed himself on me at first. I'm going, for God's sake, a do-gooder, what do you know? Until I learnt about his background and how pragmatic he was, and how no nonsense, and how strict he was. And he was tough. He was tough with them. And then, of course, I had so much respect because I saw it working. And I saw then, I guess, I don't apologise for being hard-line with locking up crooks, but I also saw this other side, that prevention really is better than cure if you can get in.
Absolutely.
I was so impressed with Father Chris, and we developed such a good bond that year. I went on to become part of his organisation of Youth Off the Streets. I was on his board and became chairman. And when he got so big, it became expanded that I couldn't, obviously, being a cop, that was just too much. So I disengaged from the organisation, and he continued on. But we are dearest friends. In fact, I was so lucky and had a Melbourne Cup day with him last week. So we regularly see each other, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to have him in my life.
And I think too, what it says is that you, like you're saying, a lot of criminals are it's environment. And if you're in a positive environment, it's fantastic, which, being a police officer, you've seen it firsthand, and I know it living it as well. If you're in a negative environment and if you break that cycle, you can absolutely change, and people can go on and live a really, really good life. And you saw it firsthand because you were very successful in that time. And I want to talk about you mentioned Madam, how you got the nickname, and how did that come about?
Oh, I don't know. I think it was probably an age thing. I was just older. And they said, I'd said to them, where did it come from? They said, Madam, it's, and maybe they just couldn't say, I don't know. It was just the way they referred to me. They said it as, they said to me, Madam, we call you Madam because we respect you. I don't know that was the case, but I'll take it.
And so can you talk to us, Deb? There's a time where you were told that you were being investigated, that you were corrupt. How did this come about, and was it a shock?
Yeah, it was. I was running this little gang unit, and I got the best advice from Paul McKinnon, my boss, who said to me, when I'm working in this world, you've got to be very mindful of perceptions and what does it look like. So I give you this advice: record. So every time I had an interaction with a gang member, I was fastidious in making documents, recording it. For some reason, the Royal Commission was on, and we knew that the Royal Commission had underpinned some corruption in King's Cross and other areas, and we knew they were in our area because, I suppose, what goes with the territory, drugs, does it bring corruption opportunities? What they didn't know is that my detective sergeant, Cole Helson, ran our on a high trust model, and everyone was a straight shooter, absolutely. Yep. But sadly, there was some truth to the rumour that the cops at Cabramatta are corrupt, and that was other cops coming into the area at a higher level doing some, inappropriate or unlawful things. But, of course, while they're looking, and they were looking for anything, well, of course, someone reports that I'm the new leader. When there was this void because Treeman Tranter got murdered, that I had control of the gang and that I was their new leader. And then I found out a whole range of things was being done. When they finally reached out, because they went to the gang members, they obviously had nothing because I was not corrupt. They reached out to the gang members, and the gang members came down to the station and handed me the card and said, "Madam, they're asking questions at our pool hall about you." And I'm going, "Who is?" And they showed me the card, and I've gone, "Oh my God," I panicked. And I rang Paul McKinnon, because by then I was contacted by the Royal Commission investigators to be interviewed. And they told me not to tell anybody. This is a whole new world for me. And I rang Paul McKinnon, probably broke every rule in the book, but I rang Paul McKinnon and said, "What do I do?" And he said, "You do nothing. You don't meet with anyone until you talk to me." And I thought, "Oh my God, I'm going to go to jail for disobeying this law."
Yep.
I didn't know. I was confused.
Yep.
And whatever he did, I then got a call back the next day from one of the senior investigators, said, "We don't need to interview you because it's been clarified and we've got all your documents. We know now what your job is. You're running this gang unit, blah, blah, blah. But just watch your back." And I said, "I'm never going to talk to another gang member as long as I live." And they said, "No, it's not a gang member." And I've gone, "Oh, okay." So I put it down to maybe, I never found out, maybe someone just thought they were doing the right thing. Maybe they saw things, that perception thing. Or maybe I hate to think that someone was trying to nobble me.
I was going to... what springs to mind, Deb, is internal white-hanting on you and maybe some jealousy in what you were achieving as where you were. And looking back now, hindsight's a wonderful thing. Did that irk you? Like it would have, or not so much?
Not so much. It irked me because I guess in a way... a whole range of things, longer story, it happened at the time. Paul McKinnon, my supporter, well, when I say supporter, I mean he was my boss, and gave me, I hope he had faith in me. He went off to be the commander of Sydney Olympics, as only he could. Yep. So I was sort of left a little bit exposed, and it didn't stop. And through Mr. McKinnon's support and advice, and sort of I was in this no-win situation, does perceptions change, and there was more came in. There was an opportunity for me to go have a little sabbatical, I guess, at Internal Affairs. Yeah, well,
let's talk about that, because you got an acting inspector's role, and after this, Alec, what was it like being on the other side and going to Internal Affairs?
Yeah, I went there for a short time. It was only there 2 years, and I did one particular job really on towards the eastern suburbs of alleged people greenlighting criminals. What I was pleased to say is that there was very few serving officers we identified in our team as being involved, or ex-officers involved. I think, going back to your point about that, is I guess what I felt was, but I haven't done anything wrong. Why am I leaving Cabramatta? Because I loved it. And Paul just said, well, I think it's just best, they all agreed that it was, it's just give it some breathing space, Deb, because you're going to keep answering these allegations if you don't. And it was going to get tiresome, and I couldn't do my job because my hands were and eventually if you throw enough mud, does it stick?
Yeah.
So it was a time, I went there, but I was so lucky. I did become then promoted to Chief Inspector and headed back out to Cabramatta for another couple of years.
And so let's talk about that role and what were you targeting at that point?
Yeah, so I went back out with a new management team out at Cabramatta in 2000, just when the Olympics were on, and now I'm a Chief Inspector, and I'm now given the role of Crime Manager at Cabramatta, which was to generally, come up to tactics to reduce crime. Clive Small was our region commander, and Frank Hansen was my commander. And there was a whole range of things going on at the time. So we just had to, we put the case up and we got new laws and we got some resourcing and we got the tactics was put in place that we did. It wasn't about numbers on the ground. It was about appropriate tactics. In other words, a mixture of covert and overt. And also we had the support of state crime at doing the middle level. So it was about just throwing everything we could at it to break its back.
Because at that stage, was heroin still as prevalent as it was when you were in the as it was in the 90s, or
it was easing off. It was still big, but as the worlds collided, which is interesting, there was a climatic drought in Burma, which was the biggest supplier of opium from the poppies in our region. So although there were some good seizures, there was great work being done at the ground level on things. We got a bit of a breather, I guess, which never did return because the heroin, that was referred to as a heroin drought. We called it the heroin shortage because there was still a little bit getting through, but it dissipated. So with a whole range of things happened. Good laws, good policing, commitment by these wonderful police on the ground, some major seizures, the climatic drought, and some resourcing.
And then you move on again. And where did you go after that posting?
Another fantastic support in my life, an assistant commissioner called Graham Morgan, who was running that specialist area called State Crime Command. And they had a number of specialist squads. And he asked me, he had a talk to me in his way and suggested, he was a very forthright person I'd never met before. And he's asked me what was my 5-year plan. And I was like, I have a 2-week plan. And I thought about it. I said, I don't know. And he said, have you ever seen yourself at State Crime Command? Because I'd been in the cops, I was now a Chief Inspector. And I said, well, I don't want to go to child abuse or sex crimes because that's not my background. And he said, when he looked at me and he said, why would you go there? You'd be hopeless. I went, thank you very much. And he said, that's not your background. I said, no, I know that, but that's where they tend to put women. And he looked at me and said, who does? I said, well, history. And he said, well, not me. Don't judge me by history. I'm me. He said, with your background, why wouldn't you go to Asian organised crime? And he said, you've got a very short time to make your mind up. Tell me today. And I thought about it and I thought, again, opportunity, don't knock it back. It won't come again. Long-term investigations at that high level, I didn't know how I was going to survive that. But I went there and had the most wonderful opportunity. And 2 years later, I think the team carried me because I didn't know how to do surveillance or all those covert investigative techniques. But they taught me and they said, we don't need you to be the expert at that. We do that. We just need you here as our leader and advocate for us and support us and argue for resources and do all that stuff. I did learn the tradecraft though. I made sure they let me do that, but I was very bad at surveillance, they tell me, which is obvious. But it was an opportunity, and 2 years later, given another opportunity to apply for the role as commander and became Detective Superintendent Commander of the Asian Organised Crime Squad. And
so, without going into too much detail, Deb, what were you sort of targeting? Was it from a command post itself, so you weren't in an area now. This was this statewide?
Yeah, we targeted high to middle level, mainly drug traffickers or any crimes, extortions involving. And again, they say, is it racist? Well, no, because there's often a cultural aspect back in those days. There still was a cultural aspect to the crime. So people that were there had to have some knowledge of what's like, not know the language, but understand the intricacies, how they work, how they operate. But mainly it was not so much import level that was being done still at the high level by the feds, but we did a lot of syndicates that were still importing and then distributing. So that high to middle level, mainly drug work.
So were you working in close proximity with, you mentioned the federal police, was it sort of like joint operations?
Not so much. There was another specialist area called the Joint Asian Group, which did that. So we were probably the step down from that.
Yep.
So they would do the big imports,
Yep.
and then we would do probably the distribution networks, the direct link, as opposed to street dealing, which I had done. So probably middle to middle high level.
Okay. And for you, you mentioned leadership and you learnt so much, and taking these roles on was the way you tackled your leadership and your leadership style. Is it, as you mentioned throughout the podcast, it's been mentors, but did you read books, or where did your leadership style come from?
Nothing formal, but that boss, Paul McKinnon, when I first took over as, I suppose, my role as leadership, he gave me the Sun Tzu, The Art of War.
Right.
So that became, I guess, my go-to book.
Yeah, right.
Because some of the principles in that, like as in, you got to understand your enemy to beat them.
Mm-hmm.
You get more with water than you do by crushing it with a rock. It sounds a bit out there, doesn't it? But
it doesn't.
But that really helped me. That was my go-to book for, and my bosses as well. They were good. And as I progressed through, a lot of those bosses retired.
Mm-hmm.
I said, oh, it's a bit like new tricks, isn't it? Like, but it wasn't like that. But I'd still made sure, because although they retired, their brain and their knowledge, I couldn't possibly grasp the years and years of experience they had. So I would still meet with them, or they were retired, to pick their brain, to run scenarios by them. What do I do? And I was never afraid to say, I don't know, I need help, and ask them. And
great, anyone who listens to this, Deb, great advice that take that, if you're unsure, ask, and you will. Most people are generally wanting, if they're honoured that you've asked, like, oh, you want my knowledge? Of course, I'll help you. As if you don't ask, you don't get, and you know that yourself and throughout your career. And was there a lot of firsts for you? Like, was there other females that were running beside you as well that were like getting into these positions as well?
Yeah, there wasn't that many. Mr. Morgan was very much about the right person for the right job. So we had some amazing women in other roles. So that I wasn't the first, and certainly haven't been the last.
No.
I guess for me it was in that gang world, I suppose, of people. There hadn't been that many women in gang. I didn't see it as a difference, and neither did my teams, I don't think. And I get asked that question a lot. Was there any barriers? And I think, the only barrier was me, because I remember when we were on the move again, and some vacancies came up. Mr. Morgan had retired, and there was a new Assistant Commissioner, Dave Hudson, and who's now the deputy. And there were some vacancies at State Crime, and he's put it out there before he advertised to say, who wants to move around, come and see me, and we'll talk about it before I advertise and see where the vacant positions are. Because I think at the time there was 12 squads and there was going to be 2 or 3 vacancies. And I wanted a change. I've been doing Asian crime since the early 90s, and now it's 2008. And I walked into his office, and I think I might have been wearing a pink frock with high heels, and and I said to him, I'd like a change. And he said, oh, would you be looking to go to homicide? And because I think everyone must have thought everyone wants to go to homicide, because it is, it's, I don't know. I don't know why everyone just did. And I looked at him and said, no, I don't want to go. He said, well, where do you want to go? And then I said, I don't know if what I want you can give me, because politically, look how I look. I've got the pink dress on. And he's just looking at me a bit dumbfounded. He said, what do you want? And I said, I'd like to go to Middle Eastern Organised Crime. And he just looked at me and said, well, you're one of the most senior superintendents. You've been doing gangs most of your life. If you want to go there, that's yours. Yep. And then he said, well, but why did you try to talk yourself out of it? And I said, I don't know. And it's what women do. We don't think we are deserving. We think we're inferior, or we don't have the qualifications, or we're not, so I went there, and that was the beginning of Middle Eastern Organised Crime for another 7 years.
That self-doubt, and we spoke about it off air, about my journey as well. And for you, Deb, you go to Middle Eastern crime, and as you said, you dealt with the Asian crime from the early 90s right up till mid 2000s. What challenges did you face with because the Middle East criminal is a very different criminal to the Asian criminal. What challenges and barriers did you face when you went to Middle Eastern crime?
Not that many, really, because they're a highly experienced team anyway. I mean, like I had these amazing detectives that have been doing them for years. You know, we're starting off at Task Force Gain before it became the formalised Middle Eastern Organised Crime Squad. So highly experienced, so they knew the ropes. Yep. I had to learn from them, but not really. And, you know, gangs, different idiosyncrasies. For example, the Asians are very understated, very savvy, very staunch. The Middle Eastern criminals, and I'm talking the Middle Eastern community, were amazing. They were so supportive of us. Couldn't have done it without them. And every time we locked up someone with Middle Eastern background, the whole community were judged, and it was so unfair. So they were keen to support us and weed out this small criminal element. Different idiosyncrasies, all about, as gangs are, it's about money, it's about power, it's about greed, it's all of those things which everyone knows about. Middle Eastern criminals differ in that they were more flashy. They weren't organised. It's funny, we called it the Middle Eastern Organised Crime Squad. I think really because it fit the name MEOCS was a brand. Maybe it should have been Disorganised Crime Squad. But they were, they drove the big flash cars. So, you know, they were beacons, for want of a better word. They stood out, you know. Everyone knew who they were, whereas the Asian syndicates you really didn't know who was running it. Middle Eastern organised crime, different to that. So, yes, I just learned about that, which was a whole new look for me in that they were, you know, but the investigation process is exactly the same.
Were they as brutal as the Asians were, or were they more brutal in the way they were doing their crimes?
Less subtle. So they were there, and which makes them more dangerous in a way, because they were less sophisticated, less organised, more dangerous because you give them a gun and they just randomly shoot, as we're seeing, you know, even today. You know, I think that was the proliferation of firing in I think it was about 2010 we hit our peak of the drive-by shootings into houses. And I always thought that was a bizarre thing because it sounds awful, doesn't it? But the Asians would hit their target. They do it subtly, dark night, blah, blah. They meant business. These are firing into a house where a house doesn't hit back. What are you doing? But there's a chance that someone you're not targeting is going to get killed. So that made us so concerned because of their lack of sophistication as opposed to being smart.
And I think too at that time, and I remember that really well, Deb, is because I was graduating from high school at that time, and it was in the news every day.
Yeah.
Another drive-by shooting, another drive-by shooting, another drive-by shooting. And did you feel, was the pressure on you to try and lock these guys up?
Huge amount of pressure. And we had to constantly ask for time. And it was funny when when it was sort of, and we, you know, there's only so many finite resources to go around. So, you know, you've got to share it with everyone in the organisation. So we did our very best, and great arrests. Like, I had an amazing team, great arrests. But I think it was interesting when we were looking at the Brothers for Life, and it was quite a bizarre one. It was the Afghani Brothers for Life, who'd been appointed by It's a long story in itself. Bassem Hamzy appointed Fahad Kwame as his commander while he's inside, because he'd sort of lost control of the Lebanese-based Brothers for Life. So in the end, it became a bit of a copyright issue about who's the true Brothers for Life. That's how bizarre it gets.
Yeah, right.
So they started shooting each other out, but certainly the Afghani crew were really on top. They were brutal and all of that dangerous, ad hoc, random public place shooting stuff. So we really targeted the Brothers for Life really hard, and we're making inroads. They're only really at their peak for about 5 months, but it was full on. So there's a lot of pressure. But it came to a head, which was interesting, when Fahad Kwame, the leader of this Brothers for Life, was on I think it was the 1st of January. It was a party cruise on the harbour at Rushcutters Bay, and as the boats made docking, it was like the who's who of criminals on the boat. And as the group's coming in, opened fire onto the boat. Well, it hits Kwame in the shoulder and a couple of, and I don't know, but certainly really brazen, like shooting at Rushcutters. I don't know whether it was the case of the brazenness of it in a public area, but that had been going on, or was it the fact it was my cynicism about Rushcutters Bay? But notwithstanding, I then got a huge increase in resources, and we took out them pretty quickly after that.
And I think as you've alluded to, that it's back in crime has changed over the years. Like you go back through, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. You go through with your painters and dockers, and it was sort of back in those sort of days. It was not in your face. It wasn't in the. It was done quiet, like you're saying. With they hit the Asians hit their mark and they hit their target. And back in those days, it was you knew it went on, but you didn't know about it. As these days, like you're saying, criminals don't care. They just that's changed.
And that's where it's so dangerous, because they have this sort of I'm sure and let's face it, the ones that are doing the shootings aren't the one. They're not the ones that are at the top. They're just giving these, I suppose, people that want to belong. Here's a gun, go out and shoot someone, and they're not good at it. So as we see, they just panic or whatever, or they just do, I'll just fire 10 shots instead of one at the back of the head, which used to be the old style gangster perhaps, which makes them less, like as I said, more dangerous in a way.
And in a sense, like you've said, and I'll say this, more stupid in a sense, like more not intellectually not smart in
that. Are they even aware of the? I don't know. They get a rush of blood. You're 100% right. I like to say is they're unsophisticated and disorganised.
Absolutely. And it's you sit there and go, really? But I guess each their own. As you're saying, people have got to earn their stripes or earn their street cred or whatever it is in that world. And it's how and even you would have seen the change from when you first became a police officer to when you finally retired. The change in that 38 years of policing was huge from when you first joined to when you retired, massively. Oh,
and we had things coming in, like they become aware of police methodology, so everyone thinks it has to change. So they're flexible. We have to be flexible as well, and the process changes. And then we're hearing more recently, of encrypted devices. Cops couldn't get access. That's all changed, and some great police work. I mean. I think it's we've got DNA, we've got huge breakthroughs scientifically. So I think that today's cop has to be so across so many other things and social. We're dealing with the cycle of the news cycle. As we know, as soon as this happens, and as I said to one journalist recently, the cops will be all over this. You just got to give them time. Because they need evidence, not intelligence to lock them up. They will. And then I think recently we've seen amazing results of some of these shooting incidents being cleared up.
Well, as you mentioned earlier through the podcast, that I think TV shows have said, oh, well, you can solve a murder in an hour, like, CSI and all this, and we'll get into you doing what you do now. So, Deb, as you mentioned, that the media, social media, and these days, social media is a bad thing for police officers. Someone gets their phone out and they don't see the whole, they only get 30 seconds of, what's happened or what might have happened. For you, the media was a good tool and it was a bad tool, but social media now and police officers today, the challenges they must face must be a hard thing from when you first joined.
It's exactly right. When we had the body worn stuff was fantastic. That came in, and our search warrant complaints dropped so much because that we record, and we had a thing at Middle Eastern that the standard operating procedures say to turn it on when you start the search. We wouldn't. We turn it on as we were walking up the front gate because that's where the hysterics start there. So we can show the context. It puts the rest what flows back into some context. So it was great. Picture paints 1,000 words. It can go in the other way because sometimes people on their cameras are filming a short amount, and before it's even an explanation, it's up on social media. Some people put their own narrative to it. So that can be but it's also good for an investigative tool because criminals, we know now, love to put themselves. As we say, the less sophisticated ones love to put themselves on social media for a whole range of things
and play the victim, and they're not victims. They're
or show themselves standing there holding a gun. Hello, that gives the cops the right to there's evidence there. Is that a support a search warrant? It looks like a real gun, or that sort of stuff. So it does give the police an extra tool as well. So,
and I think too for you, because in court, would you, like a criminal would say, oh well, they assaulted me, and the body cams, bit of forward thinking to back up your officers and say, well, it's all on footage now and it's all recorded. The body cam doesn't lie.
And I think when we first started using them, we found that our not guilty pleas reduced significantly because you go, well, there's the tape. As much as he may say to his lawyer, that didn't happen. It was, and then you play it, and then we produce the tape. And I'm sure they get some good legal advice about it. Well,
absolutely, and we'll take a break in a minute, and we'll finish part A. I'm going to call this part A. And we'll talk about part B, and we're going to get into Strike Force Raptor, the bikies, and some really exciting stuff that you ended your career on and some career highlights. But I want to just talk to you before you go. I want to talk, or before we have a break, and how important, Deb, is for any young police officer going forward, knowing your brief, going to court, and being across your brief. And can you tell, how did you prepare when you had to go to court?
Well, in those days, and we looked at these, you had to learn your evidence off by heart. You couldn't use notes. You had to recite it. So I suppose preparation was crucial. You spent half your time, preparing. Look at detectives back even before then, we were allowed to, if our memory was exhausted, be allowed to then make application to the court to refer our memory. I think these days you've got to be across your brief because bearing in mind the criminals only got one thing to focus on. Their lawyers got no doubt a lot of things, but at that time just focusing. The detective or the police officer's got so many other cases in their mind. Absolutely, you're in that one moment in the spotlight. The only thing that matters is that case.
Yep.
Regardless what's going on all around you. So preparation is key, and I have to say I think they are. They're fantastic.
Essentially they make the case, don't they?
Absolutely.
Like they are the make or break it. It's either a guilty or a not guilty, and if you're not prepared, and so many. I've heard stories of so many people, I'm across it, it's all good. And then they'd go to water as soon as they get in the witness box.
And questions, and it could be that obscure. There used to be a lawyer and he used to wait for the cop to forget a bit. And then he'd attack, not so much taking the deflection off the criminal about what they did to what the cop did, as in, well, if you got that wrong, what else have you got wrong? It was a very clever tactic, and it often worked.
Well, I've seen it firsthand myself. I was involved in a court case, and I was on the jury, and it was the defence. They're very good at what they do. The defence lawyer, and they just try and attack, and then they try and break down the credibility, and it was not. It was so different seeing it firsthand to you see all the shows and you think, oh, okay, yeah, right, this is just all. But no, it's true, and you're right. It's that at that moment, that police officer is or that team. They have one job, is to prove that criminal is guilty of what they've done, and so important. You can't so. What advice, Deb, would you give to any young police officer now? Obviously, it's changed a bit, but just preparation is the biggest.
And going way back to Paul McKinnon's advice, note-taking, recording, because we think we're going to remember it. We think it's so significant. It's just not. We've got so much in our minds going on. So at the time, making accurate notes, accurate recordings where you can go is crucial because that allows you then to move on because you can go straight back to what you started on and go, oh, there it is. I recorded it at the time. Critical.
Absolutely. So that was part one of our two-part episode with former New South Wales Police Superintendent Deb Wallace. Join us next Tuesday for part two.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Bloom. See you on the front line. Raise your glasses, podcasters. This episode of True Blue Conversations is brought to you by Wet Canteen Bottling Company. the perfect way to commemorate and celebrate life's most special occasions. Elevate your moments, savour the taste, and make them truly unforgettable with Wet Canteen. Head on over to wetcanteenbottlingco.com.au and use the code TRUEBLUE for your exclusive discount. Now, on with the show.